What if I told you that somewhere in the world, there's a photograph of you taken decades before you were born? Not someone who looks like you, not a distant relative. You, your exact face, your precise features, captured in sepia tones from 1923. This isn't science fiction. This isn't time travel. This is the horrifying reality that Sarah Chen discovered when she inherited her grandmother's estate in rural Oregon. Sarah was 26 when she first saw the photograph. A quiet librarian from Portland, she had never been particularly interested in family history. Her great-grandmother, Mei Lin, had passed away at the age of 98, leaving behind a Victorian house filled with decades of accumulated memories. Sarah was the only living relative willing to sort through the belongings. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when Sarah found the wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards of the attic. The box was heavy, ornate, carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Inside, wrapped in yellowed silk, were hundreds of photographs spanning nearly a century. Most showed people she didn't know, faces frozen in time, staring back at her with the serious expressions common in early photography. But then, she found it, the photograph that would change everything she believed about reality. There she was, Sarah Chen. Unmistakably her same narrow nose, same slight dimple in her left cheek, same unusual eye shape inherited from her Chinese ancestry. But the photograph was dated 1923, and according to the careful script on the back, it showed someone named Lin Wei, a young woman who had worked at a textile factory in San Francisco's Chinatown. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph. The resemblance wasn't just striking, it was impossible. Every freckle, every line, every subtle asymmetry of her face was perfectly replicated in this woman from nearly a century ago. She ran to the mirror, holding the photograph beside her reflection. They were identical, but that was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Sarah became obsessed with finding more information about Lin Wei. She traveled to San Francisco, spending countless hours in archives, libraries, and museums. What she discovered defied explanation. Lin Wei had worked at the Golden Dragon Textile Factory, a sweatshop that employed dozens of Chinese immigrant women in the 1920s. The working conditions were horrific. 14-hour days, dangerous machinery, and barely enough wages to survive. But Lin Wei was different from the other workers. According to newspaper reports Sarah found buried in microfilm archives, Lin Wei had begun experiencing strange episodes. She would stop mid-task and speak to empty air, claiming she could see people who weren't there. She described detailed visions of a future world with glowing rectangles that people stared at, horseless carriages that moved without steam, and buildings that touched the sky with glass surfaces. The other workers initially dismissed these episodes as exhaustion or malnutrition, but then Lin Wei began describing specific events that hadn't happened yet. She spoke of a great war that would span the entire world, of a device that would allow people to speak across vast distances, of moving pictures with sound. Her descriptions were so detailed, so accurate, that some of the workers began to fear her. The factory owner, a cruel man named Theodore Grimm, became convinced that Lin Wei was possessed by demons. In 1923, mental illness was poorly understood, and supernatural explanations were common. Grimm decided that Lin Wei was dangerous to his operation and his other workers. What happened next was documented in a police report that Sarah found in the San Francisco archives. On November 15, 1923, Lin Wei was found dead in the factory basement. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, but there were inconsistencies in the report. Witnesses mentioned that Lin Wei had been heard screaming from the basement, but when police arrived, they found her hanging from a rope, completely silent. More disturbing were the details that were not included in the official report, but were mentioned in personal letters Sarah discovered. Lin Wei's body showed signs of severe trauma. Her fingers were broken, her face was bruised, and there were burn marks on her arms. The rope used to hang her was too short to have caused death by hanging. It appeared that someone had tortured Lin Wei before ultimately strangling her with their bare hands. But the most chilling detail was found in Lin Wei's personal belongings. In her small room above the factory, investigators discovered dozens of drawings. Not typical sketches, but detailed architectural plans, technical diagrams, and portraits of people who wouldn't be born for decades. Among these drawings, Sarah found something that made her blood freeze. It was a perfect sketch of Sarah's childhood home in Portland. Every detail was accurate. The peculiar bend in the oak tree in the front yard, the chip in the third step leading to the porch, even the unusual pattern of the brick walkway. But the drawing was dated 1923, and Sarah's house wasn't built until 1960-7. Sarah realized she was dealing with something far beyond a simple resemblance. Somehow, Lin Wei had been connected to Sarah's time, Sarah's life, Sarah's experiences. But how is that possible? The answer came from an unexpected source. While researching Lin Wei's background, Sarah contacted Dr. Marcus Webb, a quantum physicist at Stanford University who had written extensively about temporal anomalies. When Sarah showed him the photograph and explained her story, Dr. Webb's reaction was immediate and intense. He had been waiting for someone like Sarah his entire career. Dr. Webb explained that he had been studying what he called temporal echoes for over 20 years. These were instances where information, images, or even consciousness could somehow transfer between different time periods. Most scientists dismissed such ideas as fantasy, but Dr. Webb had collected dozens of documented cases. According to his research, certain individuals seemed to be naturally susceptible to these temporal connections. Often, these people experienced vivid dreams about historical periods they had never studied, felt inexplicable emotional connections to specific locations, or had physical reactions to historical artifacts. Dr. Webb believed that some people possessed a kind of temporal sensitivity that allowed them to connect with individuals from different time periods who shared their exact genetic code. Sarah realized this described her perfectly. She had always experienced strange dreams about early 20th century San Francisco. She would wake up with vivid memories of walking through crowded streets filled with horse-drawn carriages, the smell of coal smoke and salt air, the sound of foreign languages mixing together. She had attributed these dreams to an overactive imagination, but now she wondered if they were something else entirely. Dr. Webb proposed a terrifying theory. He believed that Sarah and Lin Wei were the same person, existing in different temporal locations. Not reincarnation, but actual temporal displacement of consciousness. Somehow, Sarah's awareness had been scattered across time, creating multiple versions of herself, existing simultaneously in different decades. But if that were true, it meant that Sarah was not just connected to Lin Wei's life, she was connected to her death. And Lin Wei had not died peacefully. Sarah began experiencing episodes similar to those that Lin Wei had suffered. She would lose time, finding herself in locations with no memory of how she had arrived there. She would wake up with bruises and cuts that she couldn't explain. Most terrifyingly, she began to hear voices, not auditory hallucinations, but actual voices from the past. She could hear Lin Wei's voice, crying out in pain and terror. She could hear Theodore Grimm's cruel laughter as he supervised Lin Wei's torture. She could hear the other factory workers, too frightened to intervene, whispering prayers in Chinese. Sarah was not just seeing the past, she was experiencing it. The temporal connection was growing stronger. Sarah realized that whatever force had killed Lin Wei was now targeting her. The same malevolent presence that had tortured and murdered Lin Wei in 1923 was somehow reaching across time to claim Sarah as well. Dr. Webb explained that temporal echoes often created closed loops. If Lin Wei had died violently and Sarah was her temporal reflection, then Sarah was destined to experience the same fate unless the loop could be broken. But breaking a temporal loop required understanding its origin, and that meant Sarah needed to return to the place where Lin Wei had died. Against Dr. Webb's advice, Sarah traveled back to San Francisco. The Golden Dragon textile factory had been demolished in 1951, but Sarah had found the exact location through city records. Now it was a small park in Chinatown, unremarkable except for a single plaque commemorating the Chinese immigrants who had worked in the neighborhood's factories. Sarah arrived at the park just as the sun was setting. As darkness fell, she began to feel the familiar sensation of temporal displacement. The modern sounds of traffic and conversation faded away, replaced by the industrial noise of machinery and foreign voices. The park around her transformed into a multi-story brick building with narrow windows and a smoking chimney. Sarah was no longer in 2024. She was experiencing 1923 directly, seeing through Lin Wei's eyes as she walked toward her final shift at the factory. Sarah could feel Lin Wei's exhaustion, her fear, her growing certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Theodore Grimm was waiting for her in the factory basement, but he was not alone. Standing beside him were 3 other men, their faces hidden in shadow. Sarah realized with horror that this was not a random act of cruelty. This was a planned execution. Through Lin Wei's consciousness, Sarah learned the truth. Lin Wei's temporal visions had not been random. She had been deliberately targeted by a group of men who believed that people with temporal sensitivity were dangerous to the natural order of time. They called themselves the Custodians, and they had been hunting and killing temporal sensitives for generations. Theodore Grimm was not just a factory owner. He was a member of this secret organization, tasked with identifying and eliminating anyone who showed signs of temporal displacement. Lin Wei's detailed predictions of future events had marked her for death. But the Custodians had made a mistake. By killing Lin Wei, they had not eliminated the temporal anomaly. They had strengthened it. Lin Wei's violent death had created a permanent crack in time, a wound that connected her era to Sarah's. And now they knew about Sarah. As Sarah experienced Lin Wei's torture and murder through their shared consciousness, she realized that the same men who had killed Lin Wei were still alive, still hunting. The Custodians were not ordinary humans. They existed outside normal time, maintaining their youth and consciousness across centuries. They had been waiting for Sarah to manifest her temporal abilities so they could eliminate her as well. Sarah felt Lin Wei's final moments, the rope tightening around her neck, the desperate struggle for breath, the overwhelming pain and fear. But in that moment of shared death, Sarah also gained Lin Wei's knowledge. She learned how to use her temporal sensitivity not as a passive connection to the past, but as an active weapon against the Custodians. Sarah opened her eyes in the present day, park, gasping for air, but alive. She had experienced Lin Wei's death, but had not died herself. The temporal loop had been broken, but not in the way Dr. Webb had expected. Instead of eliminating the connection to the past, Sarah had absorbed it completely. She was now fully conscious in both time periods simultaneously, but the Custodians were still coming. Sarah could sense them approaching through time. Following the temporal trail that connected her to Lin Wei, they had waited over a century for this moment, and they would not be denied their prey. The final confrontation took place not in physical reality, but in temporal space, the liminal area between different time periods where consciousness could exist independently of physical form. Sarah faced the Custodians not as a helpless victim, but as a being who had transcended normal temporal limitations. The battle was not fought with weapons, but with will. Consciousness against consciousness, across the entire span of time that connected Lin Wei's death to Sarah's present. Sarah used her complete temporal awareness to turn the Custodians' own existence against them. She showed them what they truly were: parasites feeding on temporal energy, creatures that had abandoned their humanity in exchange for immortality. In the end, Sarah's victory came not through violence, but through understanding. She realized that the Custodians were themselves victims of temporal displacement. Men who had become lost between time periods and had spent centuries trying to prevent others from experiencing their same fate. Their cruelty arose from their fear of being alone in their temporal exile. Sarah offered them what they had been seeking for generations: a way to return to their proper place in time. By accepting her offer, the Custodians released their hold on temporal space and allowed themselves to finally die naturally, ending centuries of unnatural existence. But Sarah's story does not end with victory over the Custodians. Her temporal sensitivity had been permanently activated. She now exists simultaneously in multiple time periods, experiencing the past, present, and future as a single continuous moment. She has become something more than human, but less than divine. A guardian of temporal stability, protecting others who might develop similar abilities. The photograph that started Sarah's journey now sits in a place of honor in her Portland home, but it no longer shows Linway from 1923. It shows both Sarah and Linway, two faces occupying the same space, a visual representation of their merged temporal existence. Sometimes, visitors report that the photograph seems to move, showing different expressions depending on the viewing angle. Some say they can hear whispers coming from the frame, voices speaking in languages from across different centuries. Sarah continues her work as a librarian, but her real job is far more significant. She monitors temporal anomalies around the world, protecting those who show signs of temporal sensitivity from forces that would exploit or harm them. She has established a secret network of individuals who help identify and protect temporal sensitives, ensuring that no one else suffers Linway's fate. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Sarah's story is its implication for the rest of us. If Sarah could be temporally connected to someone from a different decade, what does that say about the nature of individual identity? How many of us might have temporal echoes existing in different time periods? How many historical figures might actually be displaced versions of people living today? Dr. Webb's research suggests that temporal sensitivity might be more common than we realize. He estimates that approximately 1 in 10,000 people might have some degree of temporal displacement, experiencing it as déjà vu, historical dreams, or unexplained emotional connections to specific time periods. Most never develop the full awareness that Sarah achieved, but they remain vulnerable to temporal predators and anomalies. The photograph that showed Sarah in the wrong decade was not an isolated incident, but a warning. Time is not as stable as we believe. The past, present, and future are connected in ways that challenge our understanding of reality, and sometimes, those connections can be deadly. Sarah's story reminds us that identity is more fragile than we imagine. We assume that we exist in only one time period, that our consciousness is limited to our physical bodies in the present moment. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if we are all scattered across time, living multiple lives simultaneously without realizing it? The next time you see an old photograph and feel an unexplainable sense of recognition, remember Sarah Chen and Linway. That face staring back at you from the past might not be a stranger after all. It might be you, trying to send a message across the decades, warning you about dangers you cannot yet imagine. And if you start having dreams about time periods you've never studied, if you feel drawn to specific historical locations, if you find yourself knowing things about the past that you never learned, remember that you are not alone. Others have walked this path before you. Some, like Linway, did not survive the journey, but others, like Sarah, learned to navigate the treacherous waters of temporal existence and emerged stronger. The photograph may show you in the wrong decade, but that doesn't mean you belong in the wrong time. It might mean that time itself is more fluid than we realize, and you are simply becoming aware of your place in its endless flow. The question is not whether you can handle this knowledge, but whether you can use it to protect others who might face the same terrifying discovery. Time is watching. Time is waiting. And somewhere, in a decade you haven't lived in yet, there might be another photograph with your face, capturing a moment that hasn't happened but already exists in the infinite complexity of temporal space. The only question is whether you'll be ready when you find it.